Hello, everyone. We'll get started momentarily, but we'll give folks about one more minute to sign on. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So first of all, hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon if you're joining us from a different time zone. Thank you so much for being here today. We are the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, and this is our webinar series. So we bring you these webinars to really try to facilitate discussion of science and research and best practices that are related to adaptation and resource management under rapidly changing climate, with a focus on the North Central region. And so for us, that encompasses most of the Missouri and the Upper Colorado River basins. My name is Heather Yoakum. I am the Stakeholder and Communications Lead at the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, or NCCASC. And I co-host this webinar along with my colleague Imtiaz Rangwala, who is our Climate Science Lead. So before I introduce our wonderful speaker today, just a quick word on housekeeping and some updates. So in 2021, we will be hosting this webinar monthly instead of every other month. So our next webinar is going to be on February 11th, same time, 11 a.m. Mountain Time. So be on the lookout for those announcements and to register for those. And just as a reminder, we are recording this webinar, and you can find this recording, or you will after it's done. You can find this and all of our previous webinars either on our NCCASC webpage or on our NCCASC YouTube channel. And I can drop those links in the chat if you are interested. So everyone will remain muted during the webinar, but you have the ability to unmute during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And also during the presentation, you're welcome to submit your questions and your comments via the chat box anytime. We will be monitoring that, and we'll pose those questions to our speaker during the Q&A session after the presentation. So now I am very excited to introduce Joel Smith, our speaker for today. Joel has been analyzing climate change impacts and adaptation issues for over 3 decades. He's published more than 75 articles and chapters on climate change impacts and adaptation in peer-reviewed journals and books, and has edited a number of books on climate change. He was a coordinating lead author or the lead author on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th assessment reports for the IPCC. And Mr. Smith has also been an author on 3 US national climate assessments, including the chapter lead on the international chapter for the 4th NCA. He was a member of the National Academy of Sciences panel on adapting to the impacts of climate change. And Mr. Smith has also provided technical advice, guidance, and training on assessing climate change impacts and adaptation to people around the world and to international organizations, to multiple agencies in the US government, to several different states and municipalities, as well as to the nonprofit and private sectors. And he worked for US EPA from 1984 to 1992, where he was the Deputy Director of the Climate Change Division. And he has been a consultant since 1992 and is now an independent consultant. And he stays right here in Boulder, kind of right up the road from us. So with that, Joel, thank you very much for being here today, and I will turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Heather, and thanks to both you and Imtiaz for inviting me. I'm excited to give this talk. It's a little introspective. The assignment I gave myself is adaptation to climate change. Will the U.S. be less successful than many of us had thought? I guess I'd informally call it Confessions of an Optimist, but let's get into that. What I want to cover in the introduction is sort of my thinking, but not just my thinking, many of our people in the community's thinking about our potential of the U.S. to adapt to climate change with a focus on so-called managed systems. And then I want to turn to the science to see, has the climate changed as we thought it would? Have there been surprises? And then third, I want to look at adaptive capacity because, this is not just about the change in climate itself. It's about what's exposed, how sensitive are the exposed systems, that is, what are the impacts, and then ultimately, what's the capacity of these systems to adapt to these changes? And we combine that to look at vulnerability. So that third part is we're going to look at adaptive capacity, but also, and whether it's changed as we thought it would, but also, are we applying adaptive capacity? So let's first begin with my thoughts on vulnerability, sort of way back when. And again, I've been working on this since the late 1980s. I guess my views were somewhat encapsulated in a report I was fortunate to do for the Pew Center on Global Climate Change. They don't exist anymore. They've transformed into an outfit called C2ES. But we did a series of papers on sort of state of knowledge of climate impacts and adaptation. And I wrote a synthesis. It was published in 2004. And the conclusion that I came to was that the capacity of the US economy as a whole to adapt to a limited amount of climate change with generally small impacts appears to be quite high. The country's high per capita income, relatively low population density, stable institutions, research base, and healthcare system give the United States a strong capacity to adapt to climate change. And again, emphasis there on relatively small amount of climate change, and the capacity appears to be quite high. Now, where did this come from? There were some key assumptions behind this optimism. One was that the climate would change slowly. And by the way, I apologize, some of the figures are hard to find on the internet, so I actually had to, or to get a good copy, I actually had to print them out and get a picture, but it still does the job. This is from the first IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report in 1990. And this was their projection of change in global mean temperature. And what they'd like to do is just show some straight lines. Now they weren't incorporating whether variability would change or the actual pathway, but sort of look at those lines and it can be a little deceiving. That's one problem, but essentially there was an assumption that variability would not change much. In other words, we kind of assumed, well, I should say we knew variability could change, but we didn't know how. So what we would tend to do was impose average changes in climate, and we'd use a historic climatology and essentially assume that the pattern of climate that we saw, say from 1951 to 1980 or some other period, wouldn't change. And that's important. That means, essentially no changes in the circulation patterns. But I'd say the optimism also came from an assumption that our capacity to adapt would increase, that over time, and when I say we, I mean particularly the US, would become wealthier. We'd have increase in technological capabilities, and that our ability to apply these through our governance system would stay strong, that our institutions would be strong, we'd be able to make effective decisions. Now, we recognize there were limitations. We recognize that adaptation would be costly, but not necessarily unaffordable. We were going to have to make lots of investments anyway. And so the incremental investment, whether it's in transportation systems or electricity systems or whatever, that we could afford that incremental investment. And this was based on history. We as a society, we Americans had shown a capacity to organize ourselves and sort of pay for investments to tackle difficult challenges. We built water management systems in the West, such as the Central Valley Project, the State Water Project, the National Highway System. We'd invested in public universities. We'd taken on air and water pollution control. So there were a lot of problems, a lot of challenges, needs for investment that we showed a strong capacity to take on. Now, I should clarify, my optimism has never applied to natural ecosystems. I've always been worried about what's going to happen, particularly to biodiversity, and also developing countries. And the difference there with, say, the managed systems of the United States is much more limited capacity to adapt by natural ecosystems in developing countries. All right, so I'm going to now turn to what has changed, and I'm going to address change the climate and whether there have been surprises, and then turn to adaptive capacity. So with regard to climate and whether there have been surprises, first let me say this is not a comprehensive review, but I am going to briefly touch on how have global mean temperatures, sea level rise, interannual variability, and extreme events, heat waves, hurricanes, and fires, how have those changed, and have they changed in ways that we expected? So let's begin with global mean temperature. Now, in this case, the changes we've seen in global mean temperature do appear to be consistent with projections. Global mean temperature has warmed a little more than 1 degree Celsius since pre-industrial times. In fact, there was an interesting study a little over a year ago by Hausfather et al. Where they took climate models and some of the models that were used and looked at what actual changes in forcings were rather than what was assumed. And what they found was that the models actually, when they plugged in the actual forcings, the models did pretty well in projecting the changes in global mean temperature, in this case, global mean surface temperature, GMST in this quote, that actually happened. So, in that sense, the models, our understanding of climate sensitivity has been pretty good. Now, sea level, and again, this is from the IPCC 1990 report. These are their projections of sea level rise, and they projected a range, and this is in centimeters, a range of about 30 to 110 centimeters or so by 2100 relative to about 1990. So up to about a meter relative, say, to about 2000. Now, that was in 1990. What we've become more aware of in recent times is the potential for much greater sea level rise, particularly because of more rapid melting from the major ice sheets, Antarctica and Greenland, which we didn't understand very well multiple decades ago. We're still in a process of understanding them. But the conclusion now is that and this is from a report Washington State put out and based on good work on probabilistic sea level rise that's been published in recent years. It's most likely that, and this, by the way, is in feet. I apologize for switching metrics on you, but about a 90% chance that you'd have 3 feet or about a meter, less than a meter, sea level rise by 2100. So that's consistent with the old IPCC projection, but a 10% chance that there could be more, and a very small chance that it could be several meters by 2100. So I think there's growing realization that there are low probability, but certainly very high consequence risks on the high side of sea level rise. Variability. Now, again, as I mentioned, we knew there'd be, the dry periods would be, of course, hotter, and therefore you'd have it would be even drier. Wet periods would be more wet, but we sort of assumed that the patterns of change wouldn't change much. So maybe you'd see a change in the peak rather than the extent of a wet or dry period. Some things we're seeing. One is the patterns of heat waves are changing. And by the way, in the presentation, I've got citations for all of these in the notes. This one study, as well as others, have shown that heat waves, the pattern of heat waves may be changing, and they're becoming more persistent. So we're seeing longer lasting heat waves, kind of the high pressure system sort of being stuck, if you will, in certain locations. And that means that not only is it hotter, it's hotter for longer, it's therefore drier. That could lead to outcomes such as more fire. We're also seeing change in interannual seasonal precipitation patterns. This is work by Daniel Swain, who happens to actually be now here at Boulder at NCAR, also affiliated with UCLA. And I thought this was a seminal paper we published just a couple of years ago, showing that we could see more extreme wet and dry years. So the number of extreme wet and dry years would increase, and also there would be more what he called whiplash, going back and forth between wet and dry. So you'd have a very wet year followed by a very dry year. And he published this for California, but I think this would apply across the West. We're also seeing change in hurricane behavior. Again, we always knew hurricanes would increase in intensity, but what we did not expect them to do, and what we are observing, they've started to move poleward. They're slowing down, they're moving more slowly, but they are increasing, becoming more intense very quickly, or more quickly than we thought over water. And then once they hit land, they're not losing their intensity as quickly as we thought. So all of this makes hurricanes and tropical cyclones more dangerous, more destructive than we thought. Interesting example is Hurricane Harvey. The previous record for precipitation amount was a tropical storm Amelia in 1978, 48 inches. While Harvey in 2017 had 60 inches of precipitation in particular locations. It's a 25% increase. Now, whether that's consistent with Clausius-Clapeyron, I won't get into that. We'd have to do a lot more analysis, but this is a significant change in how much just the precipitation. Of course, we're saying stronger winds, other aspects of hurricanes are changing as well. And then there's something we're familiar with here, particularly from last fall, which is fire. Now, this happens to be a picture that I took on, this is about a block from my house. This is in North Boulder on October 17th. This is at 15th and Quince, in case you're curious. This is the plume from the Calwood fire, probably about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. That day, that thing exploded. And I mean, that is something. And I have to say, to have it so close to one's, to where you live, to see it it certainly gets one's attention. What's going on here? The climate has clearly become drier, and it's increasing the vapor pressure deficit. Now, this was, again, a seminal study by Guerra and Abutting that was published just a few months ago. And if you can see, there are these, I'm looking at this figure on the right here, if you can see my cursor, this is the change in vapor pressure deficit versus the burned area. And the red dots are fires since 2000. The blue dots were fires before 2000. This is across the West. And you can see that there's a pattern. The more recent fires have higher vapor pressure deficit, also more area burned. Well, that's related to increased temperature. And in terms of how much has burned, and this is not I apologize, it's not the best figure, but this is from actually an interesting New York Times article that was published in September, but they had this wonderful graphic here showing how much area, now this is in square miles, has burned across the West, going back to middle of the last century or so. And what it shows is a few hundred square miles burning every year until about the year 2000. And then you can see this curve starts to go up, and we start moving into getting thousands of square miles burned. And in the year 2000, it's actually over 8,000. I'm not sure exactly what the final figure was for last year. Maybe somebody knows, but it's more than 8,000 square miles burned, far more than anything in the record. And you can see this dramatic upward shift. I mean, this is dramatic. And I could say this, we knew fire would increase. We always knew it would increase. And modeling studies done by people like Ron Nielsen projected increase in fire, but they didn't project this magnitude of change this quickly. I think this has caught many of us by surprise. So let me go back, stop here a second. So clearly what we're seeing is that the climate is shifting in a way, in some, not across the board, but in many respects differently than, and in some respects more dangerously than many of us had thought or been able to anticipate. We didn't rule out, we always knew there'd be surprises, but indeed we are getting some of these surprises. So let's turn now to the other side, because this is sort of how the hazards have changed, exposure, and then the question is, what about our adaptive capacity? Now, I'm going to talk about what is adaptive capacity, and I want to talk about the state of adaptive capacity in the US and how that has changed over recent decades. And then I want to address how we apply adaptive capacity. So adaptive capacity, so as I mentioned earlier, in the vulnerability formula, there is exposure. As I said, what's the hazard, what systems are exposed to it, sensitivity, what's the impact on the system, how sensitive is it, in other words, and then what's the capacity of the system to adapt. Now, there's been some work, and my citations here are Smith et al., which was the IPCC report 2001, the third assessment report, also some good work by Gary Yeo and Richard Toll looking at determinants of adaptive capacity. And there are a number of them, including wealth, technology, institutions, access to information, various things that give societies or systems the ability to adapt to climate change. Now, part of my optimism about managing climate change impacts was based on an assumption that our adaptive capacity would increase over time. So, if you allow me, I want to tell a little story here from the first National Climate Assessment, which was published in 2000. I was fortunate to be involved. And I remember we had a meeting in the days when you can meet in person and I was sitting with Eric Barron, and Eric at the time was a professor at Penn State, was on the panel, but he went on to become the head of NCAR, then president of Florida State. He's now president of Penn State. And Tony Genetos, who was lost Tony a year and a half ago. I really admired him, and it's a big loss for all of us that we lost Tony. But Eric made the statement, I don't know, we were talking, and Eric made the statement that we should say in this report that, oh, any impact we've seen is going to be worse in the future. And I think what he was basing that on was that the climate change would make events, particularly extreme events, more extreme. But I said, well, what about our ability to deal with the systems? I said, won't we in the future be better able to adapt to the changes? And we discussed this, and I remember Tony weighing in and saying, well, some things are probably going to get better, but Eric and I left it as a disagreement. But again, I was more optimistic that we'd see improvements in adaptive capacity. Whether they would keep up or exceed the changes in climate would remain to be seen, but at least it's not as if you would just impose climate change on some past state of the society, say 1990 or 2000, and say, oh, everything's worse because the climate's worse. So let's look at how things have changed in actuality. In other words, has adaptive capacity in the United States, I'm focusing on the US, has it increased over the last few decades? Okay, I'm going to look at this in several ways. Now, there is something called the Human Development Index, developed by the United Nations starting around 1990. And it looks at wealth of countries, life expectancy, and education. Combines them to sort of come up with an index on human development. Now, there are other things that contribute to human development. And so I would not say this is a complete list, but it's interesting to see what it said. So when the HDI was first published, the US was in 7th place. Now the score was 0.976, whatever that means. It's interesting to look at where we stood. The range is quite a wide range. We were a little bit behind Japan, but it went all the way down to Sierra Leone, which was quite close to 0. Okay, so 30 years later, in the latest HDI, the US is tied with the United Kingdom, 15th place. Now the score is down a little bit. I don't know if that is meaningful difference. The score, I'd have to look into that more deeply to determine that. But we are, we're not as high as we were. So relative, particularly to other OECD countries, we're lower. Now Norway's at the top. Niger is at the bottom. It's interesting, they have a higher score. If you remember, Sierra Leone had a much lower score. And developing countries have, there's been a lot of development. I'm not going to get into that now, but there's been quite a change in the last 20 to 30 years. Let's look at some other, though, aspects of what comprises the HDI and other things that contribute to development. Now, income per capita in the US, this is just going back to 2010, it has gone up, okay? And it was going up before that. We are, the country as a whole is getting wealthier, but inequality has also increased. The share of income that's going to upper income individuals or households has increased significantly, whereas the share that's going to middle income households has decreased. Low income still is getting very little, but there's been more concentration of wealth at the top. And you can see this in the Gini index, that's G-I-N-I for the US. That's also moved towards more inequality. Now, this line, by the way, this is just a straight line interpolation, so it's not showing year-to-year changes in these the distribution of wealth. Okay, life expectancy. Well, that has been increasing for the most part steadily, going back. And I'm sorry, the deck. This this goes back to about 1980, I think, or so. And I apologize for that. The cutoff years here. But what's interesting, the upper graph is life expectancy over recent decades and projecting out to the future. This goes to 2020. The lower graph shows year-to-year changes. If you look, there's a red, a little bit of red there. There was a period from about 2014 or 15 to 2018 where we actually had a decrease in life expectancy. And this is for the United States because of opioids, suicides, deaths, particularly among younger people, but not just younger people. And now it's gone up again. This does not include, though, what's happened as a result of COVID. So we'll see what happens to life expectancy when all the 2020 data are in. Education, third of the key factors affecting the Human Development Index. Well, we are seeing more people graduating from secondary school, particularly if you look in this graph on the left, people of color. On the right here is number of post-secondary graduates, and this goes from associate's degrees at the top to bachelor's degrees to master's and then to doctorate or professional degrees. And you see the numbers are moving up, so that's good. But, and I apologize for this figure, the funding has not been keeping up with the students. Now, this is education and investment from 2001 to 2015. The bottom line is federal funding. Now, you can see from about 2000, it has gone up, although it plateaued and now it's dropped. But from 2000 to about 2015, federal funding is up 15%. State funding is up here and then has dropped. That's dropped by 1/3. And so when you combine the two, the total funding from state and federal sources for higher education has dropped 14%. That's a pretty significant reduction. So we're investing less in education. That's not good for adaptive capacity. Now, as I mentioned, the Human Development Index isn't complete. There are other ways of looking at adaptive capacity. And I think one is infrastructure. So the American Society of Civil Engineers publishes a report card on infrastructure every few years, and they give grades. So this is subjective, but it's interesting to see how these grades have changed over time. And this is not all of the infrastructure, but I pulled out a few that I thought would be of interest. It's interesting if you look at the 1998-2000 columns compared to 2017. Well, bridges is a little bit better. Dams, same. Drinking water, is about the same. Inland waterways, slightly worse, D+ down to D. Roads, slightly worse. Solid waste does not improve. Transit, significantly worse, C- to D-. Wastewater, a little improvement. GPA is their average of these and other items. That's, going, well, from 2000, 2001, maybe improvement depending on your starting point. But if you go back to 98, it's a decrease. And the bottom row shows how much their estimate, ASCE's estimate of what it would cost to make up for this deficit. And you can see from 2000 to 2001, it's more than tripled, and it's probably higher now. And by the way, this does not, I presume this does not include the cost of building in anticipation of climate change impacts, where you probably want to invest incrementally more to adapt to impacts of climate change. So we're, these grades are not good, and we're not making improvements. So looking across this on the state, is adaptive capacity improving? I'd say it's a mixed report card, but it's not as much as I had thought it would. It's disappointing in many respects, particularly as education and infrastructure, which are two key areas of investment to help countries develop for the future. If you let education and infrastructure degrade, you may pay for it in terms of future development. All right. Is adaptive capacity destiny? If you have it, doesn't mean you'll be adapting to climate change. Well, my friend Ian Burton asked in an article, chapter he published actually in a book I was fortunate to edit in 2003, do we have the will to adapt? In other words, what he was getting at is, can we assume that adaptive capacity would be effectively applied? Now, I remember in a talk he gave, he mentioned Vietnam War as an example of the US having very high adaptive capacity and not using it very well in certain applications. Let's look though more recently. I think the pandemic that we're still suffering through, which is why we're talking remotely, provides some insights on adaptive capacity. And many of you may know this, what I'm going to cover here, but Johns Hopkins University has a global health security index. Now it ranks countries on their capacity to prevent, detect, and respond to disease outbreaks. So in October of 2019, they published their Global Health Security Index rankings. Okay, so number 2 was the United Kingdom. Number 1 was the United States of America. So we were ranked 1 and 2. We were the best, these two countries, and we were at the top in terms of having the best capacity to deal with a pandemic, an outbreak of some disease outbreak. Now, how did this go in reality? Well, I know this is a surprise. These are data from Worldometer just from last Friday. So, and this is ranking among 220 countries. The US in terms of cases per capita is 7th, United Kingdom 27th. In terms of deaths per capita, well, the UK is worse. They're 9th, we're 13th, but both countries, even though they're ranked 1 and 2, have done relatively poorly. Now, I'm not going to assess why. Clearly, leadership had a lot to do with it. There are other factors as well, but we had the capacity to deal with pandemics, and to date, neither country has done particularly well. So there is an interesting issue of, is adaptive capacity the right measure of whether a society will adapt? I mean, we need how do we measure application is really what I'm getting at here. And forgive me, but since we're talking about science and social science, I thought I'd try to make an analogy that, we have potential evapotranspiration, which is how much moisture could be pulled out, directly into the atmosphere or through transpiration, through vegetation. And then there's actual EET, and the difference to some extent is moisture availability. If moisture is not available, then the actual AET will be less than the potential. Well, is there some way that we can make an analogy to the policy world in terms of sort of something to the effect of how much adaptive capacity is applied? Well, I would posit that it is a function of the governance system, and that includes leadership, but also partisanship in the extent that, can we get things done? There always are political differences, but can the system operate in a way that can make decisions? Well, one way to look at our ability to get things done is to look at how united or divided are we in, excuse me, in opinions. The Pew Research Center has been surveying public opinion for some time, and they ask a series of questions and then try to judge where people stand in terms of how liberal or conservative they are, with sort of anything to the right being more conservative, anything to the left being more liberal. Now, if you start in 1994, the median Democrat, the median Republican were, not so far apart, but interestingly, there was a lot of overlap between, the most liberal Republicans and the most conservative Democrats, quite a bit of overlap here. Now, 1994 is an interesting year because that's when the Republicans under Newt Gingrich won the House of Representatives. And I think many people point to that as a point where there was less comity in Congress, more of pitched battles, if you will, that started happening between the parties. By 2004, things had shifted a little bit, not too much. By 2014, though, things were starting to come more apart. The median Democrat was more to the left, the median Republican more to the right, less overlap. And so the parties are moving apart. Now, this was before the election of Mr. Trump, further divisions and furthering this divide, I would think, although it'd be interesting to see an update of this. Also, when I wrote this abstract, it was before the very unfortunate events from last Wednesday, which really show our divisiveness. Now, maybe that's an inflection point. Maybe that will lead to some changes, will bring us together, or maybe it'll make things worse. We'll see. But clearly, we are getting more divided. This has led to something that Francis Fukuyama, who is the great historian and scholar at Stanford, calls a vetocracy. And his point is that in a vetocracy, certain political interests can veto action by the political system. Now, as he points out, our system is designed to work slowly. We have the different branches of government, different rules and all that, and it is meant to limit the potential for tyranny, but it can be overcome by a degree of bipartisanship. And I have to say, I sort of started becoming politically aware in the 1960s, and when I was a kid growing up, I mean, gee, we were passing civil rights legislation. We were expanding social protection. Medicaid came on in the 1960s. We addressed the environment. I mean, the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts passed either unanimously or close to unanimously. So broad support across Democrats and Republicans. So we were able to tackle big issues. Now we are more divided. And when there is a deep political divide, you get this vetocracy, and it's very hard to get things done now. My take is that a president gets one or maybe two major pieces of legislation they can pass while they're president. And then we go in a stalemate. And, and that may be why funding for education has gone down, why we're not dealing with infrastructure, why the grades continue to remain very poor. So let me now turn a little bit, having sort of said that, okay, there are these problems with adaptive capacity. Let me try to pull this together, looking at problem close to home. What does this mean for managing wildfires in Colorado? And this is a picture that I grabbed. This was from the East Troublesome Fire near Granby in late October, when that fire really exploded. So fires in Colorado have become substantially worse. Last year, over 600,000 acres burned. The Cameron Peak fire, which is up here to the right, that was over 200,000 acres. The East Troublesome fire, which was down here but extended over the Continental Divide, was about 190,000 acres, a little more. Now go back here. That fire grew about 100 to 140,000 acres in a single day. I don't have an exact figure, maybe somebody does on the call. The Hayman fire, which had been the record largest fire in Colorado prior to 2020, was a little under 140,000 acres. So this one fire grew in one day as much as the Hayman fire. And you remember the figure from earlier in my talk, over 8,000 square miles of fire across the West, record amount. What this suggests to me is that we may be in a crisis now in terms of fire. It just seems like any wooded area in the West is at risk of fire. And because of fire behavior, it happens suddenly. It can explode, as the East Troublesome fire did. So we have a real challenge on our hands in terms of what are we going to do to adapt to this, to mitigate this particular risk. So
you've got about 5 to 10 minutes left.
Okay, so there are about three main options to reduce wildfire risk. One is to reduce the extent of fire, that is, reduce the hazard, either through thinning or prescribed burns. That's going to cost a lot of money. I've seen the number $4 billion or so just to address the risks in Colorado. It's got to be tens of billions across the West. That's going to be money that would have to come from state, more likely to federal government. Now, would they make that kind of investment? I don't know. Again, remember the victocracy and all. We'd have to see. We did spend a lot of money on COVID relief. That was dramatic, but would that happen? Another option is to reduce sensitivity. That is, the structures that are in the wildland-human interface, wildland-urban interface, reduce their ability or the likelihood of burning. So maybe requiring more fire-resistant construction or requiring changes in landscape maintenance so fires are less likely to get close to structures. This is pretty much a local level, counties or municipal responsibilities. So are they able to do it? Well, here's a map of counties in Colorado. We have 64 counties. Now, not all of them are facing forests fire risk, but many of them are. And they differ quite considerably in their politics, their policies. I mean, you've got Weld County up here, which is quite conservative, Boulder, pretty liberal, Larimer, but you've got other counties like Fremont and others that are more conservative, Teller. They're going to also differ in terms of the technical capacity they have, the amount of resources. And so in terms of that aspect of reducing the, how sensitive development in the wildland urban interface is, seems to me that you've got a very scattered policy approach. I don't know how quickly and how evenly counties and municipalities would be able to adapt. The third option is maybe to reduce development, get more people out of the wildland urban interface. Now, that could be done through zoning. Zoning is controlled by counties and municipalities. It's hard to imagine that zoning would actually be used to boot people out of the wildland urban interface. That would be difficult to do. Maybe it could limit further development, but again, there's these differences in terms of policies. Another option is to just make it more expensive for people to be there, and that's where insurance could come in. Now, insurance is controlled by the private sector. Some states do regulate insurance and insurance rates. Colorado does not, as I understand it, regulate insurance rates for homeowners insurance. They try to keep tabs on it. So, we'd have to see how much that would accomplish. But again, we've got significant risks here, and we have these policy options, but given our capacity, our political system, how likely are they to be applied? So let me wrap this up. In some aspects of climate change are, I put this in quotes, worse than we had thought they assumed they would be. I think there's changes in variability, changes in heat waves, tropical cyclones, fires. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, adaptive capacity has not improved, at least as I had assumed it would. Again, as I said, there's a mixed record. Some aspects, some of the determinants of adaptive capacity are improving, others are not. That's of concern, but I'm particularly concerned about our ability to apply the adaptive capacity. I think the governance, the current state of our politics is a real concern in terms of our ability to address climate risks, among other risks, not the only one. So in conclusion, here's the optimist pessimist meter. I still put myself in the optimist part of the dial. We still do have the US still has a lot of adaptive capacity. Maybe not as much as we'd like, but we're not we haven't slipped to the ranks of a developing country, okay? But I'd move that dial, that arrow a little counterclockwise towards the pessimistic side. That's because of the increasing climate risks, disappointing changes in adaptive capacity, and concerns about governance. But I don't want to end on a completely downer note. I want to end on a more optimistic note. This isn't chiseled in stone, okay? We can change these things. We can do something certainly about greenhouse gas emissions, and how much climate change we're going to have, and we can do something about our ability to adapt. And I think, and you can look at it at the level even of fire management, there's a lot that can be done. So with that, I thank you, and I look forward to your questions or comments. And I've put my email there. You're welcome to reach out to me if you follow up or if your question isn't asked. All right, so thanks, Heather.
Great, thank you so much, Joel, for that. That was an amazing tour around a lot of different things that are all feeding into adaptive capacities. So I really enjoyed it, and thank you so much for sharing all of your thoughts about that. There are a couple of questions that are coming up in the chat. So one is from Stefan Tangent, and his question is about education. And so he says, you mentioned education is important, but it seems like more of a long-term aspect of adaptive capacity. So what are the short-term priorities for adaptive capacity that you would recommend to the incoming administration and to Congress? That's a big one.
That is a good question. I don't know, off the top of my head, I'm going to give an answer that I'll probably want to revise later. I'd say more, I think we need not just education, I think we need a clear leadership from the federal government on adaptation. I think we need the federal government itself to develop a national adaptation strategy. It should encourage, or maybe require, states to do that. I think states should be then requiring localities to be developing adaptation plans. Some states are doing that, by the way, California, Massachusetts. This doesn't answer the question on education, but I think one of the things that I've seen on education that I'm impressed with is, when I first got into it, there was a lot of talk about that we were in our disciplinary silos, people, and this is an interdisciplinary problem. Even this talk was interdisciplinary, but I've been impressed to see, more schools of environmental studies or interdisciplinary programs that have, I think, producing some very good graduates who are able to address problems, and whether it's bringing in scientific analysis or political science, or even analysis from the humanities or tools from the humanities. And so I think keep pushing along that way. I think keep encouraging people to think about the problems that are out there and be creative in the solutions they come up with. I'll think about this a little more. That's a good question, but that's short term. I think we're moving in the right direction. That I'm impressed with. And I would encourage schools like the University of Colorado to keep focusing on these cross-cutting problems such as these, and challenging students to learn what they need, to address these, and to think creatively about solutions.
Great. And just a reminder, you guys can unmute yourselves now and ask questions if you'd like. I will pose one more that was in the chat box, and I'll kind of add a bit of my own question to it. So Jake was asking how we can develop policies resilient to the loss of stationarity. And I'll add on to that. I was really intrigued by what you were saying kind of about the divisiveness of government, but also kind of the way that we are layered and leveled in our government. And so I was wondering, what do you see, how do you see maybe this kind of nested, like municipality, county, state, federal government, how might it pose problems to actually coming up with some of those solutions that might be resilient to stationarity or to the loss of stationarity? And how might it also provide opportunities to create those kind of better policies that might be a little bit more sustainable?
So good question. And I think this is a challenge, because we have a federal system, and I think, and we see this in the pandemic. One of the struggles is how much, do we want to be directed from Washington, from the national government, or supported, and how much do we leave it up to states? How much do we leave it up to localities? There are many layers and aspects, and you probably will want maybe some future talks on this. But I think I'm not saying we abandon federalism and look for a single uniform policy to come out of Washington. That's got pros and obvious cons. There is something to be said for, states as laboratories, even for allowing some diffusion of response. On the other hand, though, I think we have to make sure that we can't, I don't think, and then the pandemic shows that you can't just leave the states and municipalities to their own. I mean, look at the mess with the vaccination that's going on. You need some, at least federal guidance. You're going to need financial support, technical support, standards, and maybe regulations. Getting that balance right is, one of the things we've struggled with as a nation all along. And I think you have to make adjustments. But I think ultimately one of the key things too is keeping on top of problems. Understanding where you are, having metrics that you can see how well we're doing, and being able to make adjustments, when things aren't going so well. If we're, for example, we're seeing fire continuing to ravage the landscape and cause a lot of destruction of property, loss of life, then we need to do more. And then I think we need to work collaboratively on those things. But that is that's a very challenging question. And I don't think the answer is all one or all the other. It's certainly not. I'll say that. It shouldn't be just pure federalism. Leave it up to the states and localities. That's not going to work. The federal government has to be part of the adaptation solution, has to be a player at the table. And I'll just deviate. I think in the last few years, we've seen less effort there. I hope, allow me to be a little political here, but I hope with the new administration, there's going to be a focus on mitigation, but I think also there has to be a lot of focus on adaptation, resilience, and the federal government playing a leadership role. So the federal government has to be there.
Great, thank you. Lisa Dilling had her hand raised first, and then after that is Retta, and then we've got two more in the chat after that. So we'll
Okay.
queue you all up that way. So go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. And thanks so much, Joel, for a great talk. And I love the way you put the history also. And I really appreciated the update on where are we on some of these concepts. And I think you're right I think your diagnosis of the polarization and so forth is part of it. I just want to challenge or ask about a couple of issues which have sort of been raised a little already, which is, I think, what about the problem of, I don't think it's only polarization, I guess I want to say.
Okay.
I feel like just we have a lot of evidence that when it comes right down to it, localities that might be sort of more responsible in some ways for some of this adaptation, they just don't have the money. And they also don't choose to prioritize something that's happening off in the future a little bit compared to like immediate needs for policing and libraries and things their citizens want like right now. So I think that's one issue, and that brings the issue of, federal or other funds coming to the table. But there's also just I think, cultural decisions about, well, what do we prioritize and how, and do we use that? Do we use our money and our education and the things that are adaptive capacity indicators to actually make the choices that make us more resilient or not, compared to the other things that we need to do? So I think that's a big question. And there's a lot of cultural variability and a lot of differences in how tolerance for risk it comes across and what people choose to do about that risk. So I guess that was my question, was about some of the lines of thought on this are like psychological or behavioral, but not even personal, like governmental different decisions that governments can make. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with polarization. It's almost just like there's only so much money and time and staff to go around. So I was wondering what you thought about those kinds of barriers to executing on better adaptation.
It's an excellent point, Lisa. They're tough. I mean, this is part of the problem is, we tend to extrapolate from current conditions. We think that's what it's going to be like in the future. That was almost, I think, behind that Eric Barron statement, let's just take future climate change and impose it on today. Thinking about, though, how, what baseline conditions would be, what the climate situation would be, what do we need to do to anticipate that? It's very hard. It's hard enough for politicians to deal with the problems they have today. And right, they may not get many political kudos for, oh, we made this investment, we're spending more money because, 30 years from now, the next generation will be thankful. Well, that may not help that politician today or decision maker. So this is hard. I think it's just going to take persistence, particularly by those of us who are involved in this field, and keep pushing to make sure to remind people we need to think about the lifetime investments, even the pathway that investments create. If we create a roadway and it leads to development, how tenable is that development under future conditions? I'm working on a paper now for the Asian Development Bank. They are investing quite a lot in infrastructure, and they've done quite a lot of what they call climate proofing. We build infrastructure and you anticipate future changes, but they're not looking about the need for transformation. The question is, are you building infrastructure in the right locations? How tenable is the Mekong Delta, for example, given its sea level is inevitably rising, and investing a lot in that, or some of the lower lying areas of Nepal, can they withstand increased flooding? And it's not easy to address those things, but at least I think start thinking through what are the long-term risks and what can we do different now in terms of our investments to at least buy us some less vulnerability, some reduced exposure. But this is going to be very difficult, and this is an opportunity, I think, for those of you who are students and studying things, to start thinking through: are there better ways that we can incorporate future risks into current decisions? But there aren't easy answers there, so that means there's a lot of opportunity for you folks.
Thank you so much. Retta, go for it.
All right, well, I think this follows up well with Lisa's question, and thank you so much for your presentation. I was just reflecting upon, even within groups, and let's say, what I understand is that folks who identify as Democrats are more likely to believe in climate change and see it as a risk. But I think even within that, there are rifts about what adaptation strategies are amenable. And specifically when you were talking about, fire adaptation and maybe incentivizing development that's not in the WUI and in higher, more dense areas, which would have maybe some mitigation benefits too. I just foresee that people really opposing that.
Mhm.
And so I guess just again on this really tough question of how do we kind of really think about what the adaptive actions are that are likely to have the most benefit, and then get people on board with those, even if it maybe is a perception that they're decreasing their quality of their life, or whatever opposition there is associated with that.
I mean, it's a good point. And these adaptations, for one thing, going to cost a lot of money. I mean, fireproof homes. And by the way, there's a similar challenge for dealing with sea level rise. And you've got similar issues in terms of who manages the coast, what decisions are made, how consistent do they need to be, how much money is invested. There do you elevate structures that costs a lot of money. Politicians, I think, should have a vision where they want to go, but politics is the art of the possible. And I think part of it is think, how do politicians as a group, decision makers, obtain sufficient approval across the political divide? Doesn't have to mean getting everybody on board, but enough that changes can be made. And it's a slow process. We are being pushed along by the climate. Maybe that's a silver lining. And as these, as we see more and more catastrophes, I think it'll be a stronger case. Another thing in terms of the political divide, one encouraging thing is my sense is that a lot of young Republicans are taking climate change seriously, and they want to tackle it. And I think that's good. They may not tackle it exactly the same way that Democrats want to, but let's look for common ground. And my view is something's better than nothing. So at least if we can get things going, and we can always make investments, see what we can agree on, we can always improve on it too in the future. But again, this is where the art of leadership comes in, figuring out how do you, how can our politicians really lead us in a way that is effective and at least points us in the right direction of improving our capability to adapt.
Oh, these are all such great questions. I think we've got time really quick for one more because we've got about 2 minutes left. So quickly, this is from Kriti. She is asking, has anyone ever looked at psychological and emotional adaptive capacity and how that might be the basis for other kinds of adaptive capacity, or like the will to adapt?
It's a good question. I don't know. I don't have an answer, but that's a great question, Kriti. Yeah. But I think that is, I think this is part of the challenge. It's what's up here, our ability to imagine different conditions, to plan for it. It is a barrier, I think, as Lisa may have put it, the psychology, and are there ways of at least expanding our horizons, if you will. I don't know, but again, I think there's a lot of potential here, maybe for looking at these things and trying experiments and seeing where we can go.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so very much, Joel, for this amazing presentation. And thank you all for the wonderful discussion that we've had afterward. And there's also some interesting stuff about fire going on in the chat too, as well. So I'd encourage folks to check that out if they're interested in that. So again, thank you all for joining us today. I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you again next month on February 11th.
All right. Thanks, Heather and Imtiaz.